Take a look at these four images and try and figure out how on earth they help explain why World War III almost happened in 1962. This is the kind of one where you really need to know the right answer, but pause the video and see if you can try and figure out how sugarcane, Havana cigars, a communist revolutionary, and a pig in water can start World War III. So if you know your capitals enough, or if you recognise that revolutionary there, you might realise that this is all related to Cuba. Today we're looking at the Missiles Crisis in 1962. This is easily the tensest period of the entire Cold War. This is the point at which, if America or the Soviet Union had acted in a different way, World War III would have started, and that would have been a nuclear war, with both sides launching as many, if not all, of their nuclear weapons as possible. This could quite possibly have wiped humankind off the face of the earth. And if they're lucky, maybe it would have just been a third of humankind. So what a lovely topic we've got to look at today. Now on Schoology there is a Word document, but it's just fill in the blanks. So if you don't have access to that, if you just want to be making notes on lined paper, that is absolutely fine. This lesson we're just going to be focused on why there was a Cuban Missiles Crisis. Next lesson we'll look at how the Cuban crisis was de-escalated and how the crisis was solved. And the lesson after that we'll look at the results of it, or the consequences. So we need to look at why US-Cuban relations worsened in the years leading up to 1962. So you can see Cuba on the map there. It's a long cigar-shaped island there. It's less than 100 miles away from Florida, the southern tip of America, just to the north of it. Now, for most of the 1900s, Cuba had been led by capitalists. Now, remember, we've got communism, and on the other side, we've got capitalism and democracy. So obviously, if America had a choice between communism and capitalism, they're going to choose capitalism. But just because you're capitalist doesn't mean that you're democratic as well. The capitalist leader of Cuba in this period was General Batista. He had seized power in 1952 and he was undemocratic, but he was capitalist. In other words, there were no elections. You couldn't vote him out of power, but he did allow private business. He did allow capitalism and money to flourish. In particular, he allowed American money to flourish in Cuba. So American businesses poured millions and millions of dollars buying up all the important industries, in particular the sugar farms, the oil industries, the cattle ranches. All of this meant that loads of wealth was leaving Cuba and going into America. So it didn't take too long for the people of Cuba to get sick of this. After an incredibly long and bloody civil war, however, Fidel Castro took power. Now you can see from those dates there, Castro was some form of leader of Cuba from 1959 until 2011. He's the longest non-king or queen leader of any country in the 20th century. Now when he became leader of Cuba, he didn't say he was communist, he said he was socialist. And the two are linked, but they're not really the same. In many ways, Britain is a socialist country. You might remember from our medicine course that the NHS is a socialist idea. The idea of socialism is that the government controls certain key industries for the good of the people, as opposed to communism, where a truly communist government controls everything for the good of the people. So a socialist is not necessarily a bad word, unless you're an American in the Cold War, in which socialism is just another word for communism. So after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, America was already petrified that they've got a communist in their own backyard. Remember, Cuba is less than 100 miles away from Florida, so it wouldn't be too difficult to launch an invasion from Cuba, especially compared to something like launching an invasion from the middle of Hungary in the middle of Europe. So having a communist or socialist country so close to America was an issue of national security for the US president at the time, President Eisenhower. Castro distrusted America, and why wouldn't he? They'd just spent years helping the man that he had just replaced, General Batista. They'd partly done it for ideological reasons, because Batista was a capitalist, but also for selfish or economic reasons, because Batista would let America exploit Cuba and take out millions and millions of dollars. So when Castro became leader, one of the first things he did was begin to nationalize American-controlled businesses in Cuba for the good of the people. Now, nationalisation doesn't have to be a communist thing. Britain has done nationalisation before. For example, they nationalised the railways after World War II, and they've since been privatised and maybe nationalised again, who knows? But the point is, if you nationalise a business, the business owners should be compensated. You should pay them for taking the company because they don't get a say in it. You say, we are just taking this. In response, here is X amount of money. Castro didn't do that. His point was America had been exploiting them for so long, they didn't deserve any compensation. So that's not just socialist, that is clearly a communist action. It's very against the bourgeoisie or the business class. In response, America did the only thing they could do. They can't launch an invasion. They can't declare war on a country for taking money away from them. They would lose the propaganda war for that. Instead, they used their economic rather than their military power. So America stopped all sugar imports from Cuba. Sugar is Cuba's key export, even more so in the 1960s. And America, because it was so close to Cuba, was the main country Cuba sold goods to. So America was trying to destabilize or wreck Cuba's economy. Ideally, Castro would be overthrown and be replaced by another capitalist, and that way America could go back to business as usual. Instead, Castro decided to turn further away from America. He turned to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union would sell oil to Cuba at incredibly low prices and buy goods like sugar at incredibly high prices. In other words, it was a win-win from Cuba's point of view. The reason Khrushchev decided to do this was firstly a propaganda victory, the Soviet Union swooping in and saving poor little Cuba against the evil America, but also stronger ties with a country close to America could help lead to Khrushchev intimidating America, such as the Cuban Missiles Crisis. This got to the point at which in 1961, just a year or so after he became leader, Castro publicly announced that he was a communist rather than a socialist. Now, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of President Kennedy, Kennedy becoming president in January 1961. What should he do to deal with Castro? Now, I'm not asking what he did if you already know the answer to this. I'm saying what would be the best option out of these four? Should you have him removed or assassinated by sending in a highly trained team of American commandos? Should you have him removed somehow by funding Cubans who don't like him? Should you go on a charm offensive and offer him incredibly good deals, even better than what Khrushchev was offering him? Or should you watch carefully and maybe strike later when there's a better opportunity for you? Now, if you chose option one, well done. You've probably started World War III. We'll go on to why that would be in a couple of minutes' time. If you've gone for options 3 or 4, you've probably chosen a better option than Kennedy did, although it would have been hard for him to see it at that time. If you went for option 2, well done. At this moment, you are just as intelligent or perhaps stupid as President Kennedy. The reason why he was such an idiot in this specific moment was that the plan here, the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, was an absolute disaster. Now, in fairness to Kennedy, he inherited this plan from President Eisenhower, so he'd only been president for a couple of months by the time the invasion actually happened. And the CIA, kind of like the American MI5, had been lying to him, or at least kind of exaggerating how good the plans were. Now, there's going to be a optional video you can watch. It's about 5 minutes long, which goes into much greater detail as to why the Bay of Pigs invasion was such a disaster. I thoroughly recommend you watch it just because it's got real world footage and it's not my voice for 5 minutes. But the short note is that Cuban exiles, so Cubans who had been removed from the country because they'd supported Batista, were paid, funded, and trained by the Americans to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, march on Havana, the capital city, and then assassinate or remove him. Within a few days, the invasion was failed. Worse than that, it was clear that America had been involved in it. At the very least, American planes were firing on Cuba. So it's clearly an American joint action with these Cuban exiles. Now, this absolutely ruined relations between US and Cuba. They cut diplomatic ties. In other words, officially, America would not speak to Cuba, and officially, Cuba would not speak to America. This was only repaired under Barack Obama in 2015, and then Donald Trump subsequently changed that 2 years later. From Khrushchev's point of view, the Bay of Pigs is fantastic because the US and Cuba would never again solve their relations, at least while Castro was alive. It allowed Castro to get closer to Khrushchev, and then Khrushchev had the perfect excuse to send Soviet troops and missiles to protect his little friend Cuba. In reality, Khrushchev didn't particularly care about Cuba. He liked the fact that Cuba was communist, but if Cuba fell or was destroyed and every single person killed, that wouldn't be a disaster as long as the communists still won in the entire Cold War. Now, these missiles on Cuba, which sparked the Cuban Missiles Crisis, it's kind of difficult to figure out exactly how much of a problem they were. It's really a difference of could it wipe out most of America or just a lot of America? So the blue middle ring there are the missiles which were definitely on Cuba, and you can see that could wipe out a third of the place of mainland United States. But it's possible they also had these longer range, or at least intermediate range missiles on there as well, which could wipe out pretty much every single major city in America, apart from, I don't know, San Francisco and Seattle, the home of Starbucks. So you might be crying over that one. Now, the Soviets had somewhere between 40 to 100 missiles there already when the Americans were made aware of it. The problem is also the fact that it's not just Soviet missiles, there's Soviet soldiers as well. And it's got the same problem that the Soviets had in West Germany. Britain, France, America, and loads of other NATO countries had their soldiers in West Germany. That way, if the Soviets were to invade West Germany, they would have to kill British and French and American soldiers, and therefore Britain, France, and America would have to be drawn into a war, even if it wasn't for NATO. So because there are Soviet soldiers in Cuba, America couldn't reasonably invade Cuba without at least hundreds, if not thousands, of Soviet soldiers dying, which would definitely spark a war with the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev almost shielded these nuclear missiles with Soviet lives so that America couldn't invade the country. Now, we've got two more causes as to why the Cuban Missiles Crisis happened. We've got MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. We've spoken about this before, but this is the lesson in which MAD is the most important, so it's worth getting some good detail about this. Remember, mutually means you both do it. So if we come to a mutual understanding, we both understand each other. If something is assured, it's promised, it's certain, and destruction is summed up pretty well there with a massive mushroom cloud. So this doctrine or this belief is the idea that the USA and the USSR are safe from nuclear weapons because they both have nuclear weapons. The USSR got its first nuclear bomb in 1949, and from this point onwards, the arms race was simply increasing further and further and further. You got your H bombs, which are so much more destructive than your standard atomic bombs. You got those ICBMs, missiles which can launch from one continent to another. This was made even worse by the fact that Britain and France had since developed their own nuclear weapons as well. Because both sides have nuclear weapons, neither side would use nuclear weapons, because both sides know that they would both be wiped out. So it's the kind of thing which makes sense if you don't think about it for too long. There's so many different ways in which this could go wrong. But this was genuine Cold War doctrine for most of the Cold War. MAD will eventually turn to NUTS, or Nuclear Utilization Target Selection, but we'll talk about that in a good few lessons' time. The final reason why Khrushchev sent nuclear missiles to Cuba was that America sent nuclear missiles to Turkey and to southern Italy as well. Now, you might remember the Truman Doctrine of 1947. One of the reasons why Truman created his doctrine was that Greece and Turkey were struggling to fight off communism. Turkey had since joined NATO after it was set up in 1949, and one of the reasons why it was such a great place to join NATO was that it was so close to the Soviet Union specifically. So you have this missile base on the southern coast of Turkey, and you can see that its missiles, these Jupiter missiles, could blow up pretty much every major Soviet Union city. Now, you might think about a map of the world and think, but Russia or the Soviet Union goes so far more eastwards than that. But two-thirds of the Soviet Union's population is within that circle. The further east you go, the less people you get. There's very few important cities. There's very few important strategic locations. So if you can launch nuclear missiles in that slither of the Soviet Union, you can do so much damage. Now, these missiles had been here for a good few years, and the Soviet Union had constantly complained about them, saying what a threat it is to world security. With you, this idea of MAD, if they have this threat of a nuclear launch in Moscow, then they're going to be more likely to launch a nuclear missile on London or Berlin or any other place. Now, one thing which is going to be important next lesson in particular is the fact that these are Jupiter missiles in Turkey. These missiles by 1962 were already outdated. America was already planning to get rid of them, but the Soviet Union didn't know this. The Soviet Union will ask America to get rid of them, so it seems like a really big ask, but if you're going to be asked something you're going to do in a few months or a few years, you can make it seem very important. You can make it seem like it's very tough negotiations, but actually you're incredibly pleased because it looks like you're getting a bad deal, but you're actually getting an incredibly good one. So Khrushchev sent missiles to Cuba, partly to use it as a bargaining chip to force America to remove these missiles from Turkey. So we've got a few questions just to finish off the lesson, so pick at least two of these and answer them in full sentences. So for question one, which side was most responsible for raising tensions before the crisis? When I say before the crisis, I mean before Khrushchev's decision to send nuclear missiles, because obviously sending the missiles to Cuba caused the Cuban Missiles Crisis. So if you think about all of the steps before that, so all of America's interference in Cuba, and then the USSR's interference in Cuba, you've got American missiles in Turkey and southern Italy. You've also got this mad theory which both sides are adopting. But please don't just put that as, oh, they're both to blame because they're both following mad. One can be slightly more. It could be, for example, America is largely responsible, whereas the USSR is highly responsible or even more responsible. I talked before about how the mad theory is actually a rubbish theory. If you think about it for more than a couple of minutes, try to think about what sorts of real world problems might happen to cause one side to fire missiles before the other side does. In a couple of lessons' time, we'll start off by looking at an example of how this almost happened during the Cuban Missiles Crisis. And it was only because of some very quick and very calm thinking by one Soviet soldier that world Armageddon didn't happen. Now we are in topic two, and topic two has three Cold War crises. We've looked at the Berlin Wall, we're currently looking at the Cuban Missiles Crisis, and a couple of lessons' time we'll look at the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Now, if you think about the Berlin Wall, you've got the two world leaders again. You've got Kennedy and you've got Khrushchev. And we ended the Berlin Wall lesson by talking about the fact that Khrushchev wanted to bully Kennedy more. He thought of him as an inexperienced or young and foolish. So try and think about whether or not the Cuban Missiles Crisis would have still happened without the Berlin Wall. Finally, we've got a stretch and challenge in our growing examples of trying to defend communism, apparently. If you think about the fact that the USA had 9 times as many nuclear missiles than the USSR in 1962, and two of its allies also have nuclear weapons. At this point, the USSR has no other allies with nuclear weapons. How far or how fair is it to argue that the USSR was fighting for its own survival? So, in other words, trying to justify almost causing World War III by trying to defend your entire country's entire ideology. So that's everything on what caused the Cuban Missiles Crisis. Next lesson, we're going to be role-playing as President Kennedy, trying to figure out what the best option to avoid a nuclear Armageddon is.